I'm sure we'll be joined by more. But I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's discussion of Todd Browning's 1931 classic Dracula as part of the 2020 WCI Film Festival Monsters at the Movies. I'm Ray Mulstock, a lecturer in Writing and Critical Inquiry program at the University at Albany, and I'm the chair of the Film Festival. Tonight is the last night of our 5th anniversary film festival. When we pitched the project in 2015, it was with the aim of bringing together the UAlbany and Capital District communities in a shared inquiry and celebration of some of the most popular trends and genres in cinema. Since our first festival in 2016, we have shown 40 films spanning 10 decades, representing 13 nations, including 5 made right here in Albany. It's a pleasure to have a longtime supporter and participant of the festival, Dr. Mary Valentis, to lead tonight's discussion. Professor Valentis is an associate professor of English and director of the Humanities Center at the University of Albany. She's the author and co-author of The American Sublime, Essays in American Poetry, Techknowledgies, The New Imaginaries in the Humanities, Female Rage, Unlocking Its Secrets, Claiming Its Power, Brave New You, and Romantic Intelligence, How to Be as Smart in Love as You Are in Life. In addition to her academic works and book-length publications, her writings have also appeared in Self, New Woman, and Cosmopolitan magazines. Mary has made guest appearances on national television and radio shows and presents seminars in New York and San Francisco with her psychologist husband, who is also incredibly intelligent, insightful, and interesting. Tell him I say hi. She's just finished a novel about Edith Wharton's midlife sexual awakening, and she teaches courses on American literature and culture, visual culture, film and psychoanalysis, and creative writing. She co-produced 2 citywide events, Why Melville Matters Now and A Celebration of the James Family, and co-wrote and directed the Albany Mummies, shown on PBS. Please make sure to use the chat and hand raising features on Zoom and leave your names in the chat before you leave, including the names of anyone who might be sharing your screen. And now I'll turn this floor over to Mary Valentis to start tonight's discussion.
Are people coming? People are still coming in. So when I start to think about Dracula, I had just taught, I think it was last year, I had just taught the Coppola Dracula. And the Coppola Dracula is a vast way from the 1931 version. And while Coppola's is incredibly explicit and bloody and sentimental and dramatic and hyper, I think the 1931 version is very satisfying. And there's some scenes in there, and there's some excellent kinds of imagery in there. And I wanted to start with that. What, for you, most of you, what were some of the most memorable images in the 1931 version? Anybody?
Well, I'll start if no one else will. For me, okay. One of the most memorable scenes was when Renfield walks into Dracula's castle in Transylvania, and he is dwarfed by this immense set. And we get this real sense of the danger he's walking into in that moment.
Well, and it's also the parting of the cobwebs, because I think the cobwebs in some way are a kind of boundary between the so-called, not really real world, but the world of the everyday and the world of Transylvania and the peasants and all that. And then this altered state, because one of the things that I noticed in this film is that Dracula is a hypnotist. My husband is a hypnotist too. He does psychology, but he also hypnotizes people for all sorts of things. And he used to, when we had a kitty cat, he used to hypnotize her. She would get hypnotized when he was hypnotizing me for something like, weight or teaching or being scared about talking and all that kind of thing. But did you notice, Ray, the hypnosis and that kind of quality of Bela Lugosi? Because they put the mojo on you, and they put the stare on you, and that staring do any of you have kitty cats who do that? Who will, sort of come in a room and then they sit there and then they stare at people. And I think Dracula, because they had him with these kind of see-through marble eyes, was doing that to people all the time. Chiara, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was just gonna touch on that point. You were talking about any scenes that actually stuck out to us, and I think that when we first see Dracula and we see that stare, it's almost hypnotizing. It's very striking.
No, it is, and it's. I think it's more than the stare, though. It's this kind of aura around him, and some people, I think, have that kind of creepy aura anyway. And they have this kind of charisma that is a kind of negative energy around their aura. One of the things that I like to do just for fun is, before the pandemic, is to go out to Crossgates Mall. And I always tell my students, I go out there and I look at people's auras. I don't know if any of you are aura readers, but you can walk in the mall and you can see people's auras, which are the colors that surround. It's the colorist energy that surrounds a body. And I think in this movie, even though it's black and white, you see this very strange energy with Dracula. Any other scenes that are compelling to any of you?
Mary, I just want to ask, I'm sorry, Diego. When during those staring scenes, Browning used 2 pen lights to highlight his eyes. Did you come across in your research where he got that idea, if that was established in Hollywood at the time, or if he kind of invented that technique?
I think he invented it. I think that it was invented for that movie because he also, I think the other piece to Dracula and Lugosi's performance is that he has this kind of, it's not just the stare, but it's the smile. And it's like a very sinister, incredibly sinister smile, and the cape and all this. And did somebody else have a question? I didn't want to.
I didn't have a question. I just wanted to have my own point where personally I feel like the whole kind of theme or I guess idea behind Dracula is really emphasized upon Renfield being left at Borgo Pass, and then comes into contact with the driver, and it's completely silent, and then you just have that scene which it's completely you feel the tension of just the eyes looking at the camera in this case, and it's kind of staring into you, and it really sets the kind of the energy or the mood to which the whole idea of Dracula is, in my opinion.
Okay, so what your first comment? I didn't quite catch that one. It was, what was the first comment? That the whole, I got the tension, and I got the silence, and I got but you said the whole something behind Dracula.
I feel like the driver has the connection to Count Dracula, being that it's, I guess you could say, as a servant underneath him. So it kind of gives that aura, very eerie, kind of strange, what's going on type of vibe from him.
Oh yeah, absolutely, definitely. And you also get, do you remember how, one of the peasant women hands him the cross and gives them the tools on which to, that it's all the iconography and mythology around Dracula that is part of the film too, because vampires and the whole vampire mythology is filled with these iconic mirrors and crosses and all the imagery of Dracula. I think you're absolutely right. The driver is to me, when I get the resonance, and I think it's great that you pointed this out. When I get the resonance of somebody like Chiron, in Greek mythology, who is a figure at the crossing between the daylight and the night, the crossing between the unconscious and the conscious mind, because this is also a very psychological film. And one of the things I do when I do literary theory is psychoanalytic theory. And I think one of the things that you get with Dracula in the novel, in the Bram Stoker novel, but also with this, of course, are the teeth and the orality. That's a fancy word for, the oral stage of development, psychosexual development. So you have this kind of orality, this pre-Oedipal, this landscape that precedes the Dracula and the bite. So you have all these different kinds of thresholds. And I think I mentioned the cobwebs, but I think that the driver is also a figure of crossings, and he's a figure of going from one state, one altered state to another. Because I think the other thing about Dracula is, I don't know if you all know about dissociation, but dissociation is a state where you leave your body. And it happens many times when people are molested or when people are having, some kind of trauma. And I think the whole film, and I'll get to Susan in 1 second, I see her hands raised. The whole film is about post and pre-traumatic stress. I think the women exemplify the post-traumatic stress, and Dracula is a figure of stress. He's a figure that comes out of the unconscious mind, obviously, and he represents all our fears. Because and I think that's why the vampire TV shows were so popular, because they encapsulate the beautiful, horrible figure who is both life, eros, love, sex, and death. So Susan?
I just wanted to see that the scene that really strikes me is towards the end of the movie when Van Helsing confronts Dracula and Dracula tries to hypnotize him with his hand, and Van Helsing fights against it, and then the cross comes out, and Dracula, the whole thing about, I'm gonna take this this house apart stone by stone and find your wooden box and drive a stake through your heart. I always thought that was kind of striking as far as the perceived violence of it, in a way, the stake, and then I'm going to take your entire house apart and dig up the ground. And then when Dracula kind of does the hand thing, to me, that just struck me as even worse than him trying to strike him in a way, because he was attacking him mentally more than a physical attack, where Van Helsing's talking about the physical. Dracula kind of emulates that mental attack on someone. So that seems really interesting to me, between the physical and the mental of the two. Yeah, I would call them creatures.
Intrapsychic, it's intrapsychic.
Yeah.
And there are some people who are cult leaders who are able to do that to people. I'm thinking of Jim Jones. I'm not going to say any other people who come to mind, but the whole notion of the cult is very scary, and it's about fanaticism and the whole QAnon cult, that whole thing. I think Dracula. I think you're absolutely right to point that out, because Dracula uses, all his tools. He has all the tools of Hannibal Lecter. I mean, Hannibal Lecter does the same kind of thing. I think movie monsters have similarities in same ways and different ways. And when Hannibal Lecter seduces Clarice, and it's not just in the first book. It's all the way through the series. I think you're right. There's an intrapsychic attack. You also bring up the whole idea of Dracula and his house, but also he's a creature of the earth. He has to get back into the earth. And we connect earth with the Great Mother, of course. We connect with Mother Earth and all that. So I think there's a part of Dracula that is, there's an umbilical cord that's loose around him for some reason. And I think that earth piece, you know, I'm going to destroy your house. Yes. Think of Poe in The Fall of the House of Usher. And you have all that imagery too. But you also have that connection to Oedipus, to, you know, how Oedipus dies. He's eaten up by Mother Earth. And so I think that scene is, don't you think it's kind of the quintessential scene in the movie?
Yeah, you see it in a lot of different monster movies, in a sense, like the hypnotizing, the kind of mental attack, and the cult attack, you know, that kind of idea, the cult mentality. My connection to the Dracula idea is actually Edgar Allan Poe's Ligeia.
Right.
I wrote a paper when I was an undergrad about how she was more of a psychic vampire. So that was the first time I had that connection of, it's not really a physical thing, it's more of a psychic thing. So when I saw this movie around the same time, because we were reading Bram Stoker's Dracula, and my instructor said, you know, here are 2 movies she wanted us to watch, and this was one of them, and I'm blanking on the other one right now, but it was another like version of Dracula. And I think it was the earliest color one, which I don't remember what year that came out. I'm just, yeah, I'll look it up.
Was it one of the sequels?
Probably, yeah. I know that she had us
There
watch
are many
this one.
sequels to Dracula also.
Yeah.
I also wanted to mention, you mentioned Ligeia. The Fall of the House of Usher has the same kind of ideology around it.
Yeah.
With the sister and all the incest.
And the fact that she comes back, breaks out of her coffin. I always found that to be very Dracula-like, vampire-like. And so again, it was, for me, when I read Ligeia and The Fall of the House of Usher, and then we come to Dracula, I'm like, there's just this theme of like you said, going back to the earth, but becoming part of the dust, basically. And yeah, Morella is also another example, as somebody just pointed out.
Yeah, somebody just said that. Yeah,
Joseph pointed that out. Yeah, I am a huge Poe fan, so I connect him to everything.
Well, I can see why. I mean, it's incredible. But you have all these resonances in all kinds of horror. And when I teach horror writing, which is a fun class to do, because it just lets everybody's id and unconscious mind just go every place, and my students love it. But I think the precursor here in the film is Poe, definitely. You also have a very kind of parody of the horror in Nabokov's Lolita, where Quilty and the whole ending of the whole thing is a kind of mock Dracula spectacle. And you get that same kind of spectacle. I guess the other thing I wanted to mention, I mentioned this in my introduction, was that what scholars have done with Dracula as a text, and how Dracula fits into queer theory, psychoanalytic theory, feminist theory, all sorts of postmodern notions, and what this means, because it's kind of a Rorschach. And it was also the introduction of the sexual with the psychoanalytic, and in this particular pathology here. And I think you also, in the film, and certainly in the novel, you get that splitting of the female, and you do in Poe too, the splitting of the female into the prostitute and the virgin. And then it's a kind of Eve scenario where there's a kind of sexual conversion. It's like Lilith appears in the form of Mina, and of course Lucy is the promiscuous woman, and so you get this Victorian tableau of female figures who are, and the other thing I was going to mention is the whole notion of Dracula as foreign, as other, and particularly as it's a very anti-Semitic film also. And I think you see that in the Coppola film. You see it in the stereotypes of it was Gary Oldman was in that movie, and you see it in those representations, and also the notion of blood permeates the whole virality of the film and of the True Blood series. And what is it? I guess I'll ask everybody. What is it about the whole Dracula legend and its revival in terms of True Blood and the vampire revival? What is it that fascinates people about this particular myth?
I can say that I read all of the True Blood books before the show started. So I have some negative things about that because they don't follow the books exactly. And
you mean the adaptation on the movie? Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of the characters that bothered me were, to me, added strictly for the gore value of the type of vampire they were. And I like my vampires Victorian. You know, I didn't like the Twilight with the sparkly vampire. I don't really care for the way they adapted the True Blood. So I gravitate towards Dracula in this sense. I think because he is so foreign, he is so other, he's so different from anything that's in my life. Even if I just think about him as a man, you know, he's so different. And I think that really draws people into that idea that we need to be afraid of things that are different and things that like to hang around in the night. But the blood to me is the life part. Like, he needs it to keep living his extraordinary long life, but we need it, the people he feeds on need it just to live. And something in the blood, I think, is what even draws us to Dracula. So like the characters in the play, it's like they're, because he's craving their blood, that's something that he can kind of pull on in a way.
Well, I read the blood. I love what you're saying. You know, I also read the blood as a kind of narcissistic supply.
Yeah.
That he thrives on narcissistic supplies. And there are people like this who need that kind of power, need that kind of attention, need that kind of ability to hypnotize, to scare, to seduce, all that. It's interesting that you say you don't know anybody like that, but there are people who are walking around.
Oh no, I meant in the Dracula sense. Yes, I know people that are like what we call psychic vampires and all of that.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
well, also
like the plague.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. But I don't know if there's a Dracula syndrome. I think I think there is. And I think that it, it relates, you can do a reading of it because of the, the suffocation in the coffin and the earth. And I think there's an Oedipal quality to it, but, you could do a whole thing on that, going back to the womb, going back to Freud's notion of beyond the pleasure principle. I think he represents that. So there's all ways to read this, as are, there are ways to read Poe also.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things that's so interesting is that they used armadillos in this movie in order to portray rats, because the movie was made in the Western desert. And so they had armadillos. They didn't have rats available. And I think the whole notion of animality, which is a big area in terms of literary theory now, those scenes of the bat at the window, and the bat coming in, bats are actually really interesting animals. I mean, I've had a couple in the house because the people who put our new chimney in did not seal it properly. And the thing about bats is that they're disguised. They disguise themselves so well, so they're hidden. And people like Dracula are that way too. And that metamorphosis, from human to animal and back and forth, is part of any mythology. If you think about Greek mythology and you have Zeus and you have him showing up as a bull or a swan or whatever, that again is another boundary crossing between the human and the animal. And if you think about Theseus and the whole myth of Medusa, you have all that kind of thing going on too. So there are so many different registers in this film that are brought out, and I think it in so many ways, the black and white amplifies them all in a way. And as you say, it's your real Victorian Dracula, not a sparkling, creature from Hollywood.
Yes, I have a lot of bad things to say about Twilight, which I won't share here, but basically the sparkle did it for me, and I know that Ray won't.
Mary, I just want to jump us back to the armadillos for a moment. I see a lot of my own students are here from my WCI and freshman seminar classes. We watched Natalie Lawrence's TED Talk. Now, in one of the classes, we did it very, very early in the semester, in the other one a little bit later, but she specifically mentions armadillos. And I wanted to know if any of you caught that or have anything you want to add to the conversation in terms of the armadillos, not just playing the role of rats, but sort of signaling that monstrosity that Lawrence talks about in her TED Talk. Anyone remember?
It alludes to the idea of abnormality, because an armadillo is kind of like a creature that, without prior knowledge, you really wouldn't be able to pinpoint exactly what it is or what it does, being that it's a mammal, right? It's a mammal, and it has shelled armor, and then it rolls up. It could cause a lot of confusion, or it can kind of frighten you from wanting to interact with it, sort of in the same way that you would when encountered by something the likes of a vampire.
Ray, what's the name of the TED Talk?
I'll look it up and I'll put the link in the chat in just a moment, but I think it was something like how society creates monsters. It's a particularly good one.
Great. Anything else? We have a time with this, right?
Come back and unmute myself. Technically until around 6:30, so we can start wrapping things up. I'm just going to grab that link and throw it into the chat. But Mary, you brought up in your introduction, which was wonderful, thank you, a few different ways to read this. You've given us a really wonderful psychoanalytic read. You also mentioned allegory for the queer experience. We've been talking about the sex drive in my classes, and vampires as a sort of very intimate monster, having to come up close. transition of bodily fluids, for instance. What other ways are you all in the audience seeing to read the film? Or Mary, if you want to take us through a few of these other alternatives, just to sort of end us or get us approach an ending to the conversation, how vampires can play so many different roles, considering they themselves don't really change unless they start to sparkle, as Susan says.
Well, I think one that we haven't mentioned is the feminist approach, and I think the film, as I mentioned a little before, it's about splitting the female into these black and white categories, into these stereotypical categories, because Lucy, and of course in the novel it's even more pronounced. And I think you also can read it as an allegory of America and Europe, of the present and the past, all sorts of ways.
I also wonder if you could look at it as a way of, probably not a popular theory, but like male weakness, because Harker falls under Dracula's spell. And then you have the weakness of Van Helsing not being able to kill Dracula right away. And it's the women that suffer for it. Like if they could have taken care of Dracula, if Harker could have figured out what was going on earlier on, it might not have gotten to the point where Lucy and Mina even got involved. And if you think about it, he's the only reason Dracula goes after Mina is because of Harker, because he talks about her. And when Dracula starts, hypnotizing him and everything, he learns about Mina, and Mina's that pure innocent that he's most interested in. And I always thought that was kind of like a sign of the male character letting everybody down.
So
And
is it male fragility?
Yeah.
Male fragility.
Yeah. So it was interesting to me. And again, I'm going to go back to Ligeia, because the first time I read Ligeia, the man in the story totally lets the new wife down. It becomes a little clear that he has an idea what's going on and he does nothing about it because he wants his first wife back. And when she shows up, he's kind of like, oh, hey, welcome home. Not like you just killed my wife. So, I mean, this idea of in horror that you have the pure and the prostitute of women, you also have a kind of a theme of male fragility going on. Sometimes they're the reason the woman gets killed, or they're the reason the woman's in trouble. They take the bad guy to the woman in a way. So I think that's a theme too in horror.
That would be a great paper to write.
Unfortunately, I'm not I'm actually an education person. I know, I'm just fascinated with horror movies, but yeah, I actually am interested in developmental writing for writing students. But yeah, if I would, yeah, Ray, come on, write this paper. I'll give you all the notes.
Maybe we should do it together, Ray.
There you go.
We should, actually, we really should. And I'd like to add Renfield to that dynamic because
I was
his
just going to
character
say
is
that.
fascinating.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I just think that the male fragility of, I'm sorry, I have a little bug floating around. I think the male fragility is something that is not necessarily talked about a lot with, and sometimes in some of these things, like in Twilight, even the vampire has a male fragility complex going on because he's so taken in with her, and it's like he can't control himself, and it's almost creepy. And I know I'm getting off topic. I'll stop.
No, but that is also true of the blood situation, because it's Dracula's fragility in that he needs the blood.
Yes.
Mary, you started us tonight talking about Coppola's version, which I had my students listen to a podcast retelling of Dracula. We didn't have time in the shortened semester to read the novel, but they may have noticed that Jonathan and Renfield's characters were sort of smushed together. Coppola actually begins his film with a sort of prologue going back to the origin story of Vlad the Impaler and his wife looking exactly like Mina and throwing
And
herself from
trauma.
the tower.
It's all based in trauma.
Yeah. And we start that film in male fragility. And the vampire, the vulnerable vampire, has become such a trope the sexier and sexier they get. I showed my students images from Nosferatu, where we have a very creature-like vampire figure, looks very much like a bat, really elongated pointy ears, nose. We did a lot in my classes with hands like this versus hands like this, what the difference means. But Nosferatu being a much more beast-like vampire, and they just get sexier and sexier, and now they sparkle in the sun like golden gods, right? So but along with that, the fragility, that vulnerability becomes a big part of their sex appeal. I hate to admit that I have nieces and I have watched every episode of Vampire Diaries. I have not seen a Twilight film all the way through. I'm not sure which is worse, to be honest. But it's those episodes, it's learning how vulnerable these vampires are that make the women fall in love with them. So we have these interesting moves towards fragility, and that gets sort of wrapped up in this sex drive and wrapped up in these trauma dramas and psychological dramas and psychoanalytic dramas, all wrapped up in that sort of cape of the vampire.
It's a rejection of the bad boy too, I think. And the new male and all that.
And you guys just thought you were here for a horror movie.
I will say this, one thing I did find interesting about True Blood was, in leading into this idea of the fragility part, is that a lot of the women characters were the only ones that could save the vampires. Like, they're in the sun and all this stuff, they need blood. Who to go to? Suki, you know, so-and-so, so-and-so. So I did find that an interesting take on the vampire mythology, because it was showing that the vampire does have a vulnerability and that they have to have somebody help them at sometimes. And, you know, Suki was one of the main helpers, but I thought that was a really interesting take into the vampire myth, and I prefer my Nosferatu, by the way. I prefer the Beast one. I did find that one. It was the Dracula from 1958 with Christopher Lee. That was the other one we had to watch. So those two were my kind of introductions to Dracula. And then I went back and watched Nosferatu and, you know, all the other ones. So anyways, sorry.
All right, well, we're getting close to the end here. Does anyone want to leave us with one more question for Mary? Mary, is there something you'd like to leave us with? If there's one takeaway from this discussion, what would you like us to leave with?
I think the notion of trauma and the Rorschach. I think one reads Dracula as one reads one's, you know, existence. And, you know, my first marriage was to Dracula, and not now. But I think that Dracula is part of our collective unconscious. He's the penultimate seducer, but also the fragile one and the bat. I think there's so many, it's so rich. And I think that the whole Victorian, you know, if we think about Foucault and we think about what he says about the myth of Victorian repression, when actually the Victorians were not repressed at all, it was all out there to see. I think it's very much like our culture.
Yeah, that's really fascinating and really important for us to keep in mind in dealing with culture and in dealing with monsters.
Yeah.
This idea of the monster as the mirror, we read the monster as we read the self, very eloquently put. Mary, thank you so much. All right.
You were all great.
Yeah, thank you all so much for joining us for our 5th anniversary film festival lecture series. Before you sign off, please make sure to leave your names in the chats. And thank you all again. Subscribe to the YouTube channel for updates about coming festivals. And I'll see many of you Tuesday and Wednesday. Some of you I've never seen before, but it's very nice to meet you. And Mary, thank you so much for everything tonight. Wonderful discussion.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Bye, Ray.